everyone. Welcome back again to our study in suffering, 6 degrees from suffering. And so far we've looked at some lessons from Hannah and from David and from Paul and from James. And now we're going to look at something from Peter. Do you think Peter ever had the yips?
I hope not. I hope not.
The yips are a scary thing. We addressed last time a little bit the loss of confidence and some of those things. But there have been those, maybe most notably Bernard Langer, but other guys more recently, who have tried various techniques.
Sure.
And some of these guys, like Webb Simpson, when he had to move from the long putter to the short putter, they don't putt in the traditional style.
Arm lock now for Webb.
Arm lock, things like that. Kuchar, same
with claw,
thing.
arm lock and claw. So
yeah, all these variations. So are there, if I'm not a good short putter, if I suffer from having to beg my partners for gimmies all the time,
Sure.
is there something physical I can do?
Well, I think so, and I would add this too as well. You can add some weight to your putter. You know, a lot of times people don't realize that they have a fairly standard light putter, and what happens when you get nervous is grip tension can increase. Your muscles get a little bit, you get a little shaky. It's just a physiological reaction. Add a little bit of weight, or do an arm lock, where you run the putter up your left arm, and you have to have a special putter, but they make it. I know Callaway makes a putter that's called an arm lock putter, and it kind of keeps it in one motion, so we don't have a lot of hinge and rehinge. Both those things, you can actually do some things that have some impact.
Okay, good. Well, I hope that helps you if you needed this little.
Well, I use an arm lock. I used it for a long time.
Oh yeah.
And even use the claw, putt like Webb. Don't putt like Webb, but I putt like Webb. So anyway, yeah, I think it's an easy fix in some ways. Yeah.
Okay, good. We're turning to Peter today, and Peter talks about a particular brand of suffering. Really,
yes.
We joke that golf has suffering of all kinds, and we just spoke of a particular brand of suffering. Peter does the same, and he talks about suffering in the context of the persecution that first century church was encountering.
And many churches around the world today, given where you are regionally. So
absolutely, and we don't see it in the United States certainly,
right.
But there are parts of Asia and Africa where suffering for your faith is very common.
Absolutely.
Believers in China basically say you haven't learned enough yet until you've been to prison.
Absolutely.
Because they understand that suffering produces certain things. But that's a suffering for Christ, or for our faith in Christ, isn't it?
Yes, it very much.
And that's what Peter addressed.
That's what he's saying in 1 Peter chapter 4. He starts that chapter by saying to arm yourselves to suffer. I mean, think about that first of all. Set yourself up. You got to realize you need to arm yourself. Be prepared to suffer. Because what you're doing is you're sharing in the sufferings of Christ. But then, and most provocatively, in verse 14, he says something so powerful. He says, if you are reviled for the name of Christ. Now this can happen, I don't care if you're in the West, at your own country club or your golf community, wherever you're playing golf, you're ostracized, those are the crazy religious nuts that are meeting in there or whatever. If you're reviled for the name of Christ, you are, now catch this, blessed. Why? Because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Now, that grabs my attention. Always has. I'm like, look, to the degree that I suffer as Christ suffered. Now, this is very, very distinct from where we started. For instance, with David, where it came upon him because of his own failure. This is actually because you're walking with Jesus, because you're seeking the great commandment and seeking the great commission, and you're following in his footsteps, and you suffer. What happened? The glory of God and God himself rests upon you. I mean, what a blessing. What a blessing. That's powerful. It's powerful.
If I had to say, okay, of all the lessons that I've learned through suffering, there's one that rises above them all. To say, I found the presence of God in my life. I would have to rate that right at the top, wouldn't you?
No, absolutely. I think there's no question about it.
Well, do you see the presence of God readily? I mean, we have people who are watching this saying, I don't know if I've ever experienced the presence of God. I know that God is there, and I know that God has even maybe helped me through suffering, but to really recognize He's resting on me, How do you even know that's happening?
Well, I don't. It's hard to maybe self-determine that. Other than you may have a distinct sense of peace, sensations that just. But I see it in others, and I think that anyone can say that. Maybe you had a grandmother that just walked in what you would call grace, humility, a complete deference to other people, a servant's heart. Would be offended but not get offended. This is like I did something that was really they should be offended at. Never got angry. All these qualities, and I would say that's the Spirit of God in glory resting on that person, because it's a display of God's very nature Himself. So when I look at that and I say, what is the presence of God? What is the glory of God? There is a beauty when I see the facets of God in others, and I go, well, the glory of God is resting on that person. That's how I think it's most visible to me.
Okay.
And by the way, last thing, Jeff, suffering, when I think about suffering, what's the purpose? It's to release me from the slavery of my own pride most of the time.
I'm not going to let that be the last thing, though, because I want to ask you, I think what's really a central question a lot of times, if there are all these rewards we've been talking about in suffering, should I be seeking out
Absolutely
suffering?
not. No. The monastics made that, they used to go, we're going to live in a cave. A lot of the asceticism that ruled in various parts, and still does in the church in various parts of the world. The very antithesis of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, if you come to God, then you kind of get all your dreams met. The opposite would be, well, that I'm going to seek out suffering. I'm going to seek to suffer. So I'm going to, there's now abstaining from something that God told us to abstain from is one thing, but to go live in a cave and self-flagellation and all this other kind of stuff, that's not godly. It's not biblical. No, that's not God.
Okay. So I live my life, and suffering comes when suffering comes.
Suffering comes.
Sometimes it comes of this particular brand because of my faith.
Sometimes outside, sometimes from the inside.
And all of the time, in all of those kinds of suffering, I should be looking for God and expecting to see Him.
Looking for God and expecting to see Him. You couldn't say it any better than that.
Well, we are glad you've been with us. We have one more video in this series, and we look forward to seeing you next time.